The morning air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that usually came just before the neighborhood woke up. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in pale orange light. Ryan opened his front door, still half asleep, holding a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The grass was wet with dew, birds chirped lazily in the distance, and for a second everything seemed normal. But then he looked down toward the edge of his property, and froze. The ground was torn apart. A trench, deep and wide, ran around his entire land like someone had drawn a hard line between him and the rest of the world. It wasn't just some messy digging. This trench was straight and clean, carved into the earth with precision. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Ryan's heartbeat slowed, his fingers tightening around the mug. It was too perfect to be random. Fresh dirt was piled high on both sides, like the wound was still bleeding. The tire tracks on the grass were fresh, pressed deep, leading toward the road and fading into the distance. It had been done recently, probably just hours ago, under the cover of darkness when no one would see. He took a few careful steps closer, his boots crunching against the damp soil. The smell of fresh earth hit his nose. He crouched, touched the edge of the trench, and felt how smooth it was. This wasn't a prank. This was deliberate. And then he saw them, the small, bright orange flags. Dozens of them. Each one had HOA perimeter marking printed on it in cheap black ink. Ryan's jaw tightened. His breath fogged in the morning air. They had dug around his entire property like it was theirs. He walked the line slowly, tracing the trench like a hunter following tracks. It went all the way around, encircling him like a trap. And that's exactly what it was, a message. A silent threat. A way of saying, "You're not in charge here." But they had made one huge mistake. They didn't know about the cameras. Ryan had hidden them months ago, buried small motion sensor cameras in places no one would ever think to check. Under fence posts, in hollow logs, even camouflaged in the corners of his field. He installed them not because he was paranoid, but because he had learned long ago that the HOA didn't play fair. And when the HOA didn't play fair, evidence was everything. He walked back to his porch, his mind sharp now, no longer tired. He scanned the quiet street. Not a single truck, no workers in sight. Of course not. They'd finished the job under the cover of night and left before sunrise, thinking they'd get away with it. They thought this would scare him. But instead, it made something old and cold stir inside him. Ryan wasn't the kind of man to get pushed around. He had lived on this land long before Karen became president of the HOA, long before the shiny new houses appeared on the other side of the road, and long before anyone cared about aesthetic rules. He leaned against the porch railing and took a long sip of his coffee, letting the heat settle him as he thought. They wanted a fight. But they'd picked the wrong man. The sun climbed higher, and soon neighbors started stepping out of their houses. A few glanced at the trench from afar, whispering to each other. One man jogged past and pretended not to notice. Another woman slowed down, shook her head, and walked away. No one said anything to Ryan. That was how it always was with the HOA. Everyone saw. No one spoke. They were all too scared of Karen and her little army of board members. Ryan set the mug down and headed toward the shed. He pulled out a long metal pole and used it to measure the depth of the trench. 3 feet. Clean edges. Machinery had done this, not shovels. Probably a small excavator. HOA trucks had been working on the drainage system last week, or at least that's what they claimed. He knew now that was just an excuse. A distraction. But why? Why dig around his land? Then it clicked. The HOA had been trying to claim a strip of his property for months. They called it common land. He called it theft. They had threatened him with fines, sent letters, held meetings, and whispered behind his back. And now, they'd decided to stop whispering and make a move. But they hadn't counted on the silent witnesses buried in his soil. He walked toward the old oak tree at the back corner of his property. Beneath the base, hidden in a rust-proof casing, was one of his best cameras. He knelt, removed the small cover, and pulled out the memory card. He did the same at 2 more hidden spots, one near the driveway, another near the fence. By the time he returned to the house, he already felt the tension in his chest turning into quiet determination. He inserted the first card into his laptop. The screen lit up, and the footage rolled. There they were, 3 HOA trucks pulling up at 2:42 a.m. The headlights were off. Men in work gloves and vests got out, laughing. One of them was Karen's cousin, the same man who pretended to volunteer for every HOA project. Then came the small excavator, crawling down the road like a thief in the night. Another angle showed Karen herself stepping out of her SUV at 2:51 a.m. clipboard in hand, flashlight cutting through the dark. She walked around his property, pointing and giving orders like a commander at war. Ryan zoomed in on her face, smiling. That smug, satisfied smile she always wore when she thought she'd won. She never saw the tiny camera tucked into the tree behind her. She had no idea the night wasn't hers anymore. The footage continued, trucks rumbling, machines digging, workers marking the edges with bright orange flags. They finished just before 4 a.m., packed up, and vanished before dawn. Ryan leaned back in his chair, a slow grin creeping across his face. "Got you," he whispered to himself. For a few minutes, he just sat there, letting the images sink in. This wasn't just proof. This was their undoing. The HOA had overstepped, and this time, there was no way to spin it. He copied the footage to multiple drives, backed it up in the cloud, and even uploaded it to a secure server. He wasn't going to let anyone tamper with it. Not this time. As the neighborhood fully woke up, Karen appeared down the road, walking with her usual fake smile and oversized sunglasses, pretending she didn't have a care in the world. Ryan watched her from his porch, arms folded. She slowed down when she saw him, her smile twitching just slightly. She was good at pretending, but not good enough to fool him. She thought she held the power here. She thought the trench would intimidate him. But what she didn't know was that every step she took around his land had already been recorded from 3 different angles. And soon, she'd see exactly how much of a mistake she'd made. Ryan didn't rush to confront her. He was patient. He knew a storm was coming, and he wanted her to walk right into it without realizing. As she strutted past, pretending nothing was wrong, Ryan's hand rested against the porch railing, his mind already working. He would not just fight this. He would end it. The same way they tried to corner him, he would corner them, with their own actions, their own arrogance, their own trench. What they had built around his land wasn't a wall of power. It was a trap, and soon, they'd be the ones stuck in it. The sun had fully risen by the time Ryan walked into the HOA office, but the warmth of the day did nothing to ease the tension building in his chest. The building was new and polished, its white walls shining like it belonged to some perfect neighborhood where nothing ever went wrong. But Ryan knew better. Behind those smiling posters about community harmony and neighborhood pride was a board that played dirty. He pushed open the glass door, and the cold blast of air conditioning hit him like a slap. Inside, Karen sat at the long counter, wearing her oversized sunglasses even though they were indoors, tapping lazily on her tablet like she owned the world. 2 board members stood behind her, Mark, her cousin, and Roger, the treasurer who followed her like a shadow. They didn't look surprised to see him. They had been waiting. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," Karen said sweetly, her fake smile plastered on her face. "Is there a problem?" Ryan stared at her, silent for a moment, then placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward. "You dug a trench around my property last night." Karen tilted her head slightly, pretending to be confused. "A trench?" "Don't play dumb," Ryan said, his voice steady, quiet, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through the air. 3 feet deep. Perfectly straight. Orange HOA flags on every corner. That trench didn't dig itself. Mark shifted uncomfortably behind her, but Karen didn't flinch. "Oh," she finally said, dragging out the word like she had just remembered something trivial. "That's part of the community drainage improvement plan. Nothing to worry about. It's for the good of the neighborhood." Ryan let out a slow breath through his nose. The good of the neighborhood doesn't give you the right to tear into private property. She gave a little laugh, a sound that made his skin crawl. "Mr. Parker, everything the HOA does is legal. It's in the community guidelines you signed when you bought your property." He straightened, locking eyes with her. "Except my land isn't part of your jurisdiction. You know that." Roger, standing behind her, spoke up nervously. "The trench is near the border, Ryan. Maybe there was a small miscalculation. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You sent crews in the middle of the night to dig around my home without notice. That's not a miscalculation. That's trespassing." Mark opened his mouth, then shut it again when Ryan's cold stare landed on him. Karen crossed her arms, her smile fading just a little. "If you have an issue," she said, "you can file a complaint, and the board will review it in our next monthly meeting." Ryan's lips twitched, not in amusement, but in disbelief. "Next month? After you already started taking my land?" She shrugged. "We're a community, Ryan. Sometimes progress means a little inconvenience." "Funny," he said softly. "Your idea of progress always seems to involve taking something that isn't yours." Her sunglasses shifted just enough to reveal her narrowed eyes. She didn't like being challenged. "Watch your tone," she said. "You're still subject to community rules." "No," Ryan said firmly. "I'm not subject to you." For the first time, her confident posture cracked just slightly. "I'm giving you fair warning," she added quickly, her voice sharpening. "Don't start something you can't finish. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to make this neighborhood better. If you refuse to cooperate, the board will have to take further action." Ryan tilted his head, studying her face. He knew that tone. It wasn't negotiation. It was a threat. Karen didn't like control slipping out of her hands, and Ryan standing there, unafraid, was a problem for her carefully built little empire. He pushed away from the counter and walked toward the door, but before leaving, he looked back over his shoulder. "You made a mistake last night," he said evenly. "And I've got proof of every second of it." Karen froze just a fraction too long. It was subtle, but Ryan caught it. She knew exactly what he meant. She just didn't know how much he had. When he stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier but clearer. The board would scramble now. They would whisper behind closed doors, try to come up with excuses, or maybe send one of their lawyers to scare him. But they didn't realize yet that he wasn't the kind of man who backed down because of paperwork or fake smiles. As he walked down the steps, he spotted two homeowners standing nearby pretending to talk about their lawns but obviously listening to every word. They looked away quickly, afraid to be caught. That was how Karen ruled, through silence and fear. But fear didn't work on Ryan. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and stared at the trench line visible even from the road. They thought they were smart digging it at night. They thought no one would see. But the cameras saw everything. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out the USB drive with the copied footage, and tapped it against the steering wheel. This wasn't going to be some quiet, hidden fight. This was going to be loud, and when it hit, the board wouldn't see it coming. Back at the HOA office, through the tinted windows, he could see Karen turning to her board members, her fake smile gone. She was already barking orders at them. Good. Let her panic. She thought the trench would corner him. But the truth was, she had just walked herself into a corner she couldn't escape. Ryan didn't rush to act. He wasn't impulsive. He believed in letting people build their own trap with their arrogance. And Karen? She'd already started digging hers with her own hands, just like that trench. That night, as the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, Ryan sat at his desk with his laptop open. The footage played on the screen again. Truck lights off, workers laughing, Karen pointing at his fence like she owned the place. He leaned back in his chair, the faint light of the monitor shining on his face, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, we start." That night, the wind moved quietly through the trees, carrying the soft creak of old branches. Ryan sat alone in his workshop, a single warm lamp glowing above his desk, casting long shadows across the floor. On the screen in front of him, the footage replayed again and again, each second burning deeper into his memory. The trench around his land wasn't just an act of arrogance, it was a declaration of war from the HOA. They thought they'd buried the truth under darkness, but they had no idea how much he had seen. He leaned closer, his sharp eyes scanning every frame of the video. The timestamp in the corner read 2:42 a.m. The first truck appeared at the edge of the property, its headlights switched off, rolling in silent like thieves. A few seconds later, another truck joined it. Ryan recognized the paint jobs, white with green logos, the HOA's so-called community improvement vehicles. Men climbed out, wearing reflective vests, hard hats, and gloves. But these weren't city workers. These were familiar faces. He zoomed in slowly. There was Mark, Karen's cousin, the same guy who acted like a hero at every HOA meeting. He was laughing as he gave orders, waving his arm toward Ryan's fence. Behind him, two more men unloaded shovels and a small excavator from a trailer. The engine turned over with a low rumble, barely audible over the night. Karen appeared exactly 8 minutes later. Her shiny SUV stopped just far enough from the property line to look innocent, but the cameras caught everything. She stepped out in her silk robe and those ridiculous sunglasses she wore like armor. Clipboard in hand, flashlight in the other, she strutted across the dirt like a queen inspecting her new kingdom. Ryan watched as she pointed at his fence line, tapped her clipboard, and gave orders. The excavator's bucket dug deep into the soil, throwing earth aside like the land meant nothing. And Karen laughed. That was the part that made his jaw tighten, the way she laughed like it was her land, her decision, her right. She wasn't just marking territory. She was erasing him from it. Ryan exhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. Rage wouldn't help him now. Strategy would. He rewound the video and switched to another camera feed, this one from the old oak tree at the far corner of the property. The angle was perfect. It captured every movement from the moment they arrived to the second they left. Even the smallest details were crystal clear. The exact trucks, the faces, the tools, the tire tracks, the way they carried themselves like they owned the night. At 3:46 a.m., Karen's voice was caught on the hidden mic. Ryan leaned in closer as the sound played back through his speakers. "Make sure it's clean," she said coldly. "I don't want any complaints tomorrow. This is our line now. Not his." Her voice was calm, sharp, full of entitlement. She wasn't just behind this, she was leading it. Ryan copied the audio file, labeled it carefully, and moved on to the next piece of footage. A third camera, hidden near the driveway, showed their trucks leaving just as quietly as they came. They didn't even try to cover their tracks. That arrogance would be their undoing. He spent hours stitching the footage together. He layered the audio, highlighted every time Karen's voice appeared, circled faces, noted the times, marked the license plates, and measured the trench length using the reference points on the property map. He wanted it to be airtight, not just enough to make noise, but enough to break them legally. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the finished compilation on his screen. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a weapon, a silent hammer waiting to fall. Ryan wasn't a man who rushed to fight. He was the kind who built his case, step by step, until the other side had nowhere left to run. He transferred everything onto multiple USB drives and encrypted backups. One stayed with him. One he'd drop in a safety deposit box. One would go to his lawyer first thing in the morning. Then he opened a plain folder on his desktop and drafted his first email. Not to the HOA. Not to Karen. He wrote directly to the county land authority, attaching a clean copy of the video. He kept his words simple: trespassing, property destruction, evidence attached, request immediate inspection and record protection. He hit send. Then he drafted a second email, this time to the HOA board members excluding Karen. His tone was colder this time. You crossed my land. You broke the law. I have footage of everything. This is your one chance to do the right thing before this goes public. He didn't send it yet. He wanted them to sweat first. He saved it as a draft and shut the laptop. Outside, the trench still lay like a scar in the earth. He walked out with a flashlight, following the line slowly. The night was silent except for the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. He stopped at the far corner and crouched down, running his fingers over the fresh tire tracks. They were deep, heavy machinery had passed through. He followed them a little farther down the road, and they disappeared near the HOA's maintenance shed. Of course. They hadn't even tried to hide it. He smiled faintly. That was the thing about people like Karen. They thought they were too smart to be caught. They thought no one would stand up to them. And they never noticed the quiet ones, the people who didn't shout but waited patiently to strike when the time was right. As the clock crept toward 2 a.m., Ryan finally went back inside. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. He'd spent years dealing with the HOA's petty games, letters about the color of his barn door, fines for parking his truck in the wrong direction, warnings about the plants he grew near his fence. But this was different. This was their biggest mistake yet. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd dug it. He poured himself another cup of black coffee and looked out the window at the trench. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a countdown. In the morning, the board would walk around pretending everything was normal. They'd smirk. They'd say the word compliance like they always did. And that's when he'd make his move. They had their trench. But he had their faces, their words, their plans, all carved into footage they couldn't erase. In that moment, Ryan felt the same cold calm he used to feel when he fixed a broken machine. Methodical, focused, unstoppable. Karen had started this war in the dark. But he would end it in the light. And when the board tried to deny everything, they'd find out that the quiet man at the edge of the neighborhood wasn't someone they could bury. He'd already caught them in their own trap. The sun was high when Ryan walked into the community center. It wasn't just another HOA meeting this time. It was the special session Karen had called to address concerns. Everyone in the neighborhood was there. The trench had become the talk of the town. People whispered in small groups, some pretending to support the board, others nervous because they finally realized what the HOA could do to them too. Karen sat at the head of the long table like a queen at her throne, surrounded by Mark, Roger, and the rest of her loyal board. Her sunglasses rested on the table beside her clipboard, her posture straight and practiced. She looked confident, but Ryan could see the cracks beneath that fake smile. She knew something was coming, even if she didn't know exactly what. The projector screen behind the board was lit and ready. Ryan didn't rush. He walked in slowly, with calm steps, carrying a small USB drive in his hand. Every step echoed against the polished wooden floor. Karen tilted her head when she saw him, trying to control the moment. "Mr. Parker," she said with that same sickly sweet tone, "you're here early. Would you like to file your complaint before the meeting starts?" Ryan didn't answer her question. Ryan nodded. "We received your submission and the video evidence. We'll begin inspection immediately. I need your permission to access the perimeter." Ryan gestured toward the trench. "Be my guest." The inspectors walked the line carefully, their boots crunching on the disturbed soil. They used measuring rods, laser levels, and GPS markers to trace exactly where the trench had been dug. Every few steps, they stopped, marked a point, and wrote something down. Ryan watched them work like a man who had already read the end of the book. He knew what they would find. And he knew what it would mean. Karen tried to approach the lead inspector with her practiced HOA charm. "Good morning," she said with a forced smile, holding her clipboard like a shield. "We're happy to cooperate with your office. This was all a misunderstanding, just some minor drainage work. All of this is technically community space." The inspector didn't even look at her. Please step back. We'll determine that." Her smile faltered. She tried again. "We're very organized here. We've done dozens of improvement projects. Everything is documented." The inspector finally glanced at her, his voice dry. "I've seen your documentation." Her face stiffened. "Oh. The one where you trespassed onto private property at 2:42 a.m., he said. "The video is quite clear." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in years, Karen's words failed her. The inspector turned back to the trench and called over his colleague. "Property line is here," he said, tapping a metal marker buried in the grass. "Trench is 2.5 feet over the boundary. This isn't just close, it's way past." His colleague whistled low. "That's not a mistake. That's deliberate." Ryan didn't say a word. He just watched as their faces turned redder with each measurement. When they reached the far end, the inspector turned to Ryan again. "You were right. The trench crosses fully into your property on 3 sides. It's a clear violation. Based on your video evidence, this isn't an accident. It's premeditated construction on private land without consent." Karen tried to interrupt. "It wasn't me personally." The inspector held up a hand to silence her. "You were present in the footage giving instructions. You can explain that to the county attorney." A murmur rose among the homeowners who had gathered to watch. Some were pretending to be just out walking, but everyone knew why they were really there. They wanted to see the Queen fall. And she was falling fast. The inspector walked back to his truck and returned with a folder. He handed a copy to Karen and another to Ryan. "This is the notice of violation," he said. "The HOA is facing fines, mandatory restoration orders, and a possible criminal trespassing case if the property owner decides to pursue it." Ryan accepted the paper calmly, reading every word with quiet satisfaction. Karen stared at hers like it was written in a foreign language. Her voice cracked. "This is absurd. You can't fine us for trying to improve the neighborhood." "We're not fining the neighborhood," the inspector said flatly. "We're fining the HOA. And based on this evidence, you personally may be liable." That was the moment her composure cracked like thin glass. She spun toward Ryan. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You could have talked to me. We could have fixed this quietly." Ryan met her eyes, steady as a rock. "You dug the trench quietly. Now we fix it loudly." She took a step toward him, but the inspector's voice cut through like a blade. Step back." The rest of the board shifted awkwardly. Roger looked ready to disappear. Mark's face was pale, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. They'd followed Karen for years, but now, in the face of legal reality, no one wanted to stand next to her. Ryan didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He didn't need to. The law was speaking louder than he ever could. The inspectors finished their work, taking more pictures, collecting measurements, and marking areas for restoration. Before they left, the lead inspector turned to Ryan and handed him a card. "You have strong evidence. If you want to press charges or sue for damages, this will hold." Ryan slipped the card into his pocket. "Thank you." Karen stumbled after the inspector as he walked away, her voice desperate. "There must be something we can do. A payment plan. A warning." He didn't even look back. "Talk to your lawyer, When the trucks finally pulled out, silence fell over the neighborhood. Karen stood in the street, clutching the violation notice like it was a death sentence. The board members avoided her eyes. Homeowners whispered in small groups. And Ryan. Ryan turned and walked back to his porch, the sun warm on his face, his boots crunching on the same soil they had tried to take from him. He sat down slowly, watching Karen from a distance. For years, she had controlled this neighborhood with her rules, her threats, her fake charm. She thought she could take his land and bury the evidence. But she hadn't realized that the moment those cameras caught her under the moonlight, the power she thought she had was already gone. She tried to rule with fear. But fear doesn't work on a man with proof. Ryan leaned back in his chair and took a long sip of coffee, letting the victory settle in quietly. It wasn't about gloating. It was about knowing they finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. And this was just the beginning. The trench they dug around his land wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was their undoing. And now, the whole community had witnessed it. The trench that had once been a silent threat around Ryan's land now stood as a legal line that the HOA could never cross again. What they thought was a display of power had turned into a wall closing in on them. A week after the county inspection, a thick envelope arrived in Ryan's mailbox. No logo, no decoration, just clean, white paper with the name of his lawyer embossed at the corner. He opened it at the kitchen table, the morning light spilling across the wood. Inside were copies of the formal claims, a drafted lawsuit, and a notice that the HOA had already been served. The board was being held accountable for illegal trespassing, property destruction, and attempted land seizure. Karen's name was at the top of the list. He read the papers slowly, his lips tightening into a quiet, cold smile. This wasn't about revenge. This was about setting things right once and for all. The next few days were filled with chaos, not for him, but for them. Karen stormed into his property line on the third day, but this time there was no smile, no fake calm. Her face was pale with panic, her carefully styled hair messy, her clipboard nowhere to be seen. "Ryan," she shouted, her voice shaking more from anger than power, "you can't do this to us. You're suing the community." Ryan stood at the top of his porch steps, arms folded, his expression steady and unreadable. "No," he said flatly. "I'm suing you and the people who broke the law." "It's the same thing," she snapped. "The HOA is the community." "No," Ryan corrected calmly. "The HOA is a board of people who forgot their place." For a moment she was silent, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the right words. Then she tried another tactic. "Do you have any idea what this will do to property values? To the reputation of this neighborhood?" Ryan didn't move. "Maybe it'll teach people not to let bullies run it." Her voice cracked, losing its smooth edge. "You're destroying everything we've built." He let out a short, humorless breath. "You dug your own trench, Karen. All I did was show the world." She flinched at that. The word trench wasn't just dirt and concrete anymore. It was a mistake carved into the ground for everyone to see. By now the entire neighborhood knew about the lawsuit. People who once smiled politely at her now crossed the street to avoid her. Cars slowed when passing Ryan's land, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen had spent years building an image of control, of a perfect neighborhood under her leadership. Now, that image was crumbling in front of everyone, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Ryan didn't attend, but he didn't have to. Through the thin walls of their glass community hall, voices rose and cracked. Mark shouted something about stepping down. Roger argued about legal costs. Someone mentioned Karen's name, and the room exploded into accusations. When the meeting finally ended, Karen came out alone. The others didn't even walk beside her. That night, Ryan sat on his porch while a cold wind moved through the dark, rustling the trees. The trench still traced the edges of his land, but it felt different now. It wasn't a sign of their power anymore. It was evidence. Ironclad, time-stamped, undeniable evidence. His lawyer called him the next day. "They're scrambling," the man said over the phone. "They're trying to negotiate before this hits the courtroom." Ryan sipped his coffee slowly, staring at the line of trees. "I'm not interested in deals. They didn't ask for my permission before tearing my land apart. I'm not giving them an easy way out." "Then we'll proceed," the lawyer replied, almost sounding impressed. "I'll schedule the deposition dates. From what you've provided, their defense doesn't stand a chance. You've got them cornered." That word again. Cornered. It was exactly where they had tried to put him. And now it was where they stood, with no way out. A few days later, Ryan got a formal letter from the HOA's attorney, written in polite, desperate language. They offered to fill the trench, pay for damages, and resolve the matter privately. He read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and tossed it into the trash. The time for quiet deals was over. They didn't deserve to walk away with a fine and a weak apology. They needed to feel the weight of what they'd done. The day of the deposition arrived, and Karen walked into the lawyer's office with none of her usual arrogance. No sunglasses, no sharp smile. She looked smaller, like the queen had lost her crown. Her voice shook as she tried to explain why she was on Ryan's property at 2:42 a.m. The recording played again. Her own voice, cold, commanding, echoed in the conference room. "Make sure it's clean. This is our line now. Not his." Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Karen covered her face with both hands. It wasn't just Ryan watching her break apart. The court reporter, the attorneys, and soon the entire legal system would see it too. After the deposition, the HOA's legal team called Ryan's lawyer again. This time, they didn't offer a private settlement. They begged. But Ryan remained silent. Sometimes silence is louder than any threat. Word spread fast. Homeowners, once silent out of fear, started showing up at HOA meetings demanding Karen's resignation. They weren't just angry, they were done being controlled. Roger resigned first, then Mark. Within 2 weeks, the board was in shambles, and Karen was standing alone. Lawsuits have a way of stripping away the masks people wear. The trench she had ordered dug had become the weapon that shattered everything she built. Ryan didn't rush anything. He watched calmly as the legal hammer fell, one blow at a time. Fines were issued. Charges were filed. The county froze HOA funds. Karen's personal liability was added to the list. And every time she tried to deflect the blame, the footage, the one she thought would never exist, played again like a ghost haunting her. She called Ryan late one night, her voice shaking. "Please," she whispered. "I can't afford this. I'll lose everything. Can we make this stop?" Ryan stood by the window, looking out over the trench that was now just a scar waiting to be filled. "You should have thought of that before you tried to take my land," he said quietly, then hung up. He didn't feel guilt. He felt justice. For years she had ruled with fear, and now she finally understood what it was like to be powerless. The legal hammer was no longer in her hands. It was in his. And he wasn't going to miss. The courtroom was crowded that morning. Even though the case wasn't technically a criminal trial, the whole neighborhood had shown up like it was the event of the year. People whispered in the hallways, their voices carrying that mix of curiosity and satisfaction. Everyone had lived under the HOA's thumb for years. Everyone had seen the way Karen walked around with her clipboard, dictating how high their grass could grow, what color they could paint their doors, or how late their porch lights could stay on. But now, the woman who ruled them all wasn't sitting at the head of a table giving orders. She was sitting in the defendant's chair, pale, tired, and trapped. Ryan walked in without saying a word, wearing a plain black jacket, calm as ever. He didn't need to play hero. He didn't need to make speeches. The truth was enough. His lawyer gave him a nod as he took a seat at the front. On the other side of the room, Karen clutched her water bottle so tight her knuckles were white. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but her eyes were locked on the floor. She had spent years looking down at people. Now she couldn't lift her head to face them. The judge entered the room, the bailiff called the session to order, and everything went still. Ryan's lawyer presented the footage again, the same footage that had cracked Karen's empire. The screen showed those HOA trucks arriving in the dead of night. It showed her pointing at the ground like she owned it. It showed the excavator tearing into his land without permission. And worst of all, it captured her voice, sharp and arrogant, declaring, "This is our line now." Not his. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. Karen's lawyer tried to argue it was an innocent mistake, that the trench was for community drainage. But the timestamps, measurements, and counter reports made that argument collapse faster than her smile had at the meeting. Ryan sat quietly, his hands folded, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't angry anymore. He didn't need to be. Everything was happening exactly as it should. When it was Karen's turn to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "It wasn't personal," she said. "I was just doing what I thought was best for the community." The judge's voice cut through the air like a blade. By trespassing onto private property at night with construction equipment? By deliberately ignoring property lines and legal boundaries? Karen opened her mouth but nothing came out. Her lawyer tried to salvage what little was left, but the judge had already made up his mind. The HOA was found liable for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. Karen personally was held responsible for authorizing the illegal activity. Heavy fines were imposed, legal fees awarded, and an order was signed forcing the HOA to fill and restore the trench at their cost, with additional penalties if they failed. Ryan didn't smile. Not when the gavel hit the block, not when the room erupted in whispers. But deep down, a knot inside him finally loosened. Justice didn't need to shout. It just needed to land. After court, Karen walked out through the side door, avoiding everyone's eyes. Her once loyal board members weren't with her. They had abandoned her weeks ago. Her empire had crumbled, and all she had left were fines, lawsuits, and the heavy truth that she had built her power on fear, not respect. And fear doesn't last forever. Ryan stepped outside into the crisp air, the sunlight warm against his skin. A small crowd of neighbors stood near the steps, waiting. For the first time in years, they weren't avoiding him. They weren't whispering behind his back. They were standing openly, heads held a little higher, their eyes filled with something new, relief. One older man stepped forward, nodding. "You did it," he said simply. Ryan shook his head slowly. "No. She did it to herself." People began talking about new elections, about taking back their community, about never letting someone like Karen control them again. They had been afraid for so long, but now they could finally breathe. A few days later, the trench was gone. County crews filled it in at the HOA's expense, smoothing the ground back to how it had been before. The bright orange flags disappeared one by one, leaving nothing behind but solid, untouched earth. Ryan stood there as the last truck drove away, the hum of the engine fading into the distance. Where their arrogance had left a scar, now the land looked clean again. Whole. Free. Karen's house went up for sale soon after. She couldn't handle the backlash, the humiliation, the neighbors who once feared her now looking at her with disgust. Within a month, she was gone, leaving behind a legacy of broken rules and one unforgettable story. The HOA board dissolved after her departure. A new committee was formed, this time made up of people who actually cared about the community, not controlling it. They stripped away most of the pointless regulations, focused on fixing things rather than policing them, and most importantly, they left Ryan alone. The man who once stood alone against their intimidation was now the man everyone respected. Not because he shouted louder, but because he stood taller when it mattered. One evening, as the sun set and the sky burned orange over his land, Ryan walked the property line slowly. The grass had grown back where the trench once lay. The air smelled like fresh earth and pine. He stopped under the old oak tree, the one that had hidden the camera that started it all, and leaned against the rough bark. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't the silence of being cornered. It was the silence of freedom. A few of his neighbors stopped by as they passed. They waved, not nervously like before, but with genuine warmth. One woman called out, "Glad you never back down, Ryan." He gave a small nod. "Some things are worth standing for," he said softly. He didn't need to say more. Everyone knew what he meant. That trench had been more than dirt. It had been a line between control and resistance, between fear and courage. And when they crossed it, they wrote their own ending. He had simply finished it. Later that night, Ryan sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee. The stars were bright, the neighborhood calm. No more threatening letters. No more HOA trucks. Just the sound of crickets and the soft breeze moving through the trees. He looked out at his land, his home, and whispered, "They thought they could take it." A faint smile touched his face. They were wrong. And with that, the story of the trench ended not with a fight, but with a lesson the entire neighborhood would never forget. Never again would someone like Karen draw a line through his land and call it theirs. Not while he was still standing.